The standards of the confinement and imprisonment are established by the United Nations under the Mandela rules. That comes from Nelson Mandela. They were established the 17th of December, 2015. UN standard for minimum treatment of prisoners. This is now considered the lowest level of treatment. So, this is the basic that the UN is requiring for how you detain and hold prisoners. 122 rules that cover all aspects of prison management and outline the agreed minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners, whether pretrial or convicted. These rules have been supplemented by UN Bangkok rules on the treatment of female prisoners. I don't cover that during this training. We're just going to look at the basics with the Mandela rules. And again, this is a summary. Prisoners must be treated, rules 1 through 5. Prisoners must be treated with respect for their inherent dignity and value as human beings. Torture and ill treatment is prohibited. Prisoners should be treated according to their needs without discrimination. The purpose of prison is to protect society and reduce reoffending. It is not to punish an individual or to make him unable to defend himself. The safety of prisoners, staff, service providers, and visitors are at all times paramount. So they have a right to see staff have assistance. Allocation 59. The rules require prisoners to be housed close to their home to facilitate social rehabilitation. I was just trying to do this quickly. So the closer they are to their families, to getting jobs afterwards, this is considered very important. So sending somebody from Moscow to Siberia is completely a violation of this Mandela rule. Registration, rules 7 to 8. Information that should be collected and entered into the prisoner file now includes names, location, family, so that any injuries or complaints about prior ill treatment can be reported. Information. They must be given information about the prison regime. They must know how to access legal advice in a language and a manner that they understand. Prisoners' property. They have to be allowed to have their property in safe custody along with an inventory. Medical screening. They have a right to be screened as soon as they arrive to detect if they have any medical condition that will have to be watched and monitored and cared for while they're in prison. Categorization. Certain groups of prisoners must be housed separately as a means of protection and to facilitate adequate individual treatment. This applies to men and women, pretrial convicted prisoners, children, and adults. For example, children should not be housed with adults. Women should be housed separately. For example, if there's issues in the country or in the prison with treatment of LGBTQ, that's also something that can be considered. Putting them in separate facilities so that they're not abused. It hasn't been, in terms of political positions, I have not read anything about housing people with political views separately in terms of protecting them in prison. An individual assessment is important to identify any risk prisoners may pose to themselves, to staff, or other prisoners, but also risks that they might be exposed to, specific needs they might have, and rehabilitation measures that should be taken. Classification systems should be flexible in order to support the individualization of treatment. Special needs, you have to make, the prison should be taking into account any special needs, physical, mental, or otherwise, for the prisoner. Standardized prisoner file management system so that all information is kept on record, so that there's no surprise that this person has just died of some condition, or there's no surprise that that this person hasn't been allowed to see their lawyer because they're being held in a certain part of the country, that they don't have access to their lawyer. All of this should be transparent and open, hopefully on an electronic database. Information. Each file should include information on the whole range of issues, from their personal data, their requests, requests for classification, disciplinary sanctions, medical files. All of that should be kept separately and confidentially and made accessible to the prisoner and to his attorney. Hygiene. Basic hygiene. And this is something, if you're monitoring or working with the defendant, you should see that there's water, that they have clean bedding, that they have the basic sanitary conditions and hygienic conditions are met, that they have food, and food meaning that not just eating bread every day, but eating something that is balanced enough so that their health and their mental capability to defend themselves in court and to stand trial isn't diminished. Sleeping. If accommodation is cell-based, there's supposed to be, under the Mandela rules, one prisoner per cell. But when there should be, if there's multiple prisoners in dormitories, there should be a selection process where they decide who is put together. There should be proper heating, ventilation, air, light, and minimum floor space provided. Children. Decision on whether children are accommodating in prison with their parent is based on the best interest of the child. And if you're working with a woman who's pregnant, that has to also be taken into consideration, how she's held and her conditions. Discipline and sanctions, information. The rules recognize that understanding rights and obligations is key for day-to-day prison management. A defendant, a person in prison, has to promptly upon their arrival know what the rules are and not be sanctioned after because he didn't know what the rules are. They have to be provided this information in understandable language and format. Procedures for searches must be laid down in law or regulation, and any decision on whether to conduct a search must must be based on whether it's necessary and proportionate. Search procedures must respect the dignity and privacy of the prisoner. It should not be used to harass or intimidate. Invasive body searches should be the last resort. Searches of visitors at a minimum must be subject to the same safeguard as searches of prisoners and take account of their status as non-prisoners. So if you're a lawyer going in to see your defendant who's in prison, you should not be searched in a way that violates your privacy or violates the respect for your dignity. Again, the rules on solitary confinement, going back to this because this is extremely important. It should not be more than 15 days. For some groups, women, especially if they're pregnant or breastfeeding, solitary confinement is prohibited under the United Nations rules. The rules define solitary confinement as confinement for more than 22 hours per day without meaningful human contact. Interpretation of meaningful human contact should recognize the suffering that any person will experience if isolated or deprived of contact with human beings. Disciplinary offenses. The rules outline procedures and safeguards that should be in place The rules outline procedures and safeguards that should be in place to respond to allegations of disciplinary offense. Laws or regulations must clearly define what is a disciplinary offense in prison. Any sanction has to be proportionate to the act. The application of disciplinary sanctions must be recorded. Again, jumping back to what we just spoke about in the start of the Mandela rules, everything has to be recorded, from their entry into prison to their health to every single time they're sanctioned and the reasons for them being sanctioned. The use of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms is encouraged. And when the interests of the justice require, particularly in cases involving serious disciplinary charges, prisoners must be able to defend themselves in person or through legal assistance. So if possible, they should have the right to call a lawyer to assist them if they're being disciplined unfairly. Instruments of restraint that are inherently degrading or painful are prohibited. I think we had a number of cases. I remember we spoke about at the European Court of Human Rights with Russia. We have also with the Magnitsky case of handcuffing individuals to their bed or whatever. This is extremely prohibited. It's considered painful. Anything that's painful or degrading is prohibited. Their use is only legitimate if no lesser form of controlling an actual risk is available, and they must be removed as soon as possible. So if defendant is acting extremely irrationally, is hurting other people, there can be cause to restrain them, but it would have to be to that level. And as soon as the person is calm and can move on, he has to be unrestrained. Um, they are, as we mentioned before, in terms of getting a fair trial, defendants should not be entering court with their handcuffs on. They should be coming in. They should not be held in prisons behind cages when they're in court. This is all indicators of an unfair trial, unfair use of restraints, as well as causing bias for the judge and jury and the press. Use of force. Except in cases of self-defense or attempted escape, staff should not use force on prisoners. Any use of force must not exceed what is strictly necessary and should be subsequently reported. Only in exceptional cases should prison and staff be armed. UN standards also require strict regulation on the use of force, and that arbitrary or abuse of the use of force should be considered a crime and be punishable as a criminal offense. Family and friends, they should have a right to receive visits and contact their friends by phone or letter. It should never be restricted as a form of discipline. Legal representative, they should have adequate opportunity, time, and confidential facilities. And I think that was discussed before when we discussed the right to a lawyer, that you should have a private area that's not being recorded, that's not being watched by any guards for a defendant to speak to his lawyer. And they should have a place that they're able to keep their legal documents. Foreign nationals have a right to get in touch with their embassies. Rehabilitation. Prisons should offer education, training. In the US, that's a big thing in terms of libraries, education, teachers coming in. Work. They should never be allowed to work in a form of that would be considered servitude or slavery. Any work should give a minimal remuneration. The US has this. Prisoners are put to work. They earn very little, but they are remunerated for their labor. They cannot work for free because that's considered slavery. Providing meaningful activities such as mental health, rehabilitation, exercise, library, education. Access to healthcare, number one, that's a big deal. As it keeps being repeated here, it deprives their liberty if they cannot, and ability to defend themselves if they don't have healthcare. Inspections. In recognition that inspections are an integral part of a professional prison system, there's a twofold system to be put in place that includes internal monitoring of the prison system as well as external independent monitoring. The purpose of such monitoring is to ensure that prisons are managed in accordance with the laws and regulations, and the rules list the authority inspectors should have and clarify the reporting and follow-up procedures. So it's very important that the person running the prison is ensuring that there's an inspection and that there is a greater inspection, be it from the state or from international. If we haven't even begun to discuss like prisoners of war, but there has to be some sort of external organization, either the state or an international group inspecting the prisons. Mandela Rule summary: investigations. Prisoners must report any death in custody, disappearance, serious injury, and if they believe that torture or inhumane treatment may have occurred, irrespective of a formal complaint. So if you're working with an individual and he hasn't filed a complaint, but you see evidence of anything such as this, such as injury, torture, you have to report it immediately to an independent authority. I know this is difficult, but it should be somebody within the state. For instance, in the US, you would go to the US Attorney's Office where the prison is being held, or to the state authority. But if it's not possible, it's always something to report it to, for example, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and make it public that there's some violation going on. Everything that's taken from the prisoner has to be returned to him when he's released. Opportunities should be made to reintegrate back into the society.